I don't know if it automatically does it. I started it. I have to like input all this info. Okay, should be live.
Okay, sorry, I'll start. Belina Mai, and welcome this afternoon. The HK West Maui Community Fund wants to remind folks to enjoy the mele of West Maui with the musical albums Le Na Honoa Pi'ilani, Songs of West Maui, and Le Na Honoa Pi'ilani Na Mele Ho, which is available. It's actually up for a Na Hoku Hano Hano Award this year, and are available. Both albums are available digitally and in CD form from mele.com. And both accompany the songbook Le Na Honoa Pi'ilani, distributed by Kamehameha Publishing. Proceeds from all sales go to Na Leo Kalele, the West Maui Kaiapuni Auxiliary Organization. Mahalo, enjoy Professor Kuwada's talk. Aloha.
Aloha mai kako. Mahalo everyone for joining us this evening. Since 2018, the Aikaneo Maui Cultural Center has been hosting the free public HK West Maui Community Fund Kanaka Scholar Lecture Series. This series is co-sponsored by HK West Maui Community Fund, the University of Hawaii Maui College Hawaiian Studies Department Program, and the Ku'e Petition Hui. The lectures occur monthly. The series features a host of new and established scholars, also innovators, and their research and work on Hawaii and Hawaiian communities. We proudly present this to you via Zoom and live through HK West Maui's Facebook page. Tonight's presentation, Kamana Unuhi, Threads of Translation Through Our History. Dr. Bryan Kamaoli Kuwada is an assistant professor at the Kamakakūokalani Center for Hawaiian Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, focusing on translation theory. He has been an editor of the journal Hu'ili, multidisciplinary research on Hawaiian well-being, and is part of the blogging collective Ke Kaupuhei Ale, a group of Indigenous Pacific and Allied scholars, poets, and activists. Give a virtual round of applause for tonight's speaker. Aloha me vilina mai, Dr. Bryan Kuwada, and enjoy everybody. Mahalo.
Aloha, aloha mai kako. Thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be here for this audience, for this this cultural center that you folks are, have done all of these cool things with. And I'm just pretty a little bit nervous, but I'm pretty so proud to be able to present to this community of people who care so much about our lahui and who have been fighting for our lahui for so long. And yeah, I'm probably more on the side of the newer scholar kind of thing. So I wanted to introduce myself a little bit, especially because, we're not meeting in person. And so, because if we were together, we'd get to chit chat a little bit and talk story and whatever. And so this is Zoom. And so I wanted to introduce myself a little bit, just so it's not some random long-haired guy talking to you folks about translation on your screen. So my name is Bryan Kamaoli Kuwada. Like Kanani said, I like to surf. That's my picture of me surfing with very dirty wax on my surfboard. I kind of was embarrassed to use that picture. I was like, I should Photoshop the wax to make it a little bit nicer. But I thought maybe that'd be a little bit getting carried away with Photoshop. But some of the things that I do, I'm mostly a writer. So I've been a translator as well. So one of the things I helped translate was Moʻolelo o Hi'iaka i Kapoli o Pele. I was one of the apprentice translators on that. Me, Saho Fukushima were under the direction of Puake Noblemeyer. And then I took on a project translating Moʻolelo o Kamehameha e Kahi with Emelani Case and Bo Bassett, if you folks know them. They're great, scholars in their own right and activists and really interesting people who do cool work. I also worked as a legal document translator for a little while, doing mostly royal patent grants and stuff like that, land documents, which is in a way the easiest kind of translation because everybody agrees that this word means this word in English. But it's also, I feel like there's the most stakes, most at stake when you translate legal documents. And so I actually kind of didn't like doing that, too much pressure. So I don't do that anymore. And I actually am not that much of a translator anymore. I feel like when I started translation, working on translation in early 2000, there was more of a need for it. People needed to have these moʻolelo brought into English. Not everybody, of course. Some people needed, these moʻolelo to be brought into English in a way that was more caring and more aware of our traditions and our culture. And now I feel like so many people are learning ʻŌiwi Hawaii, and that translation isn't quite as necessary anymore. So I don't do translation as much. I mostly write things. As Kanani said in the intro, I'm a blogger, or I was kind of a blogger for a while. I wrote this piece called "We Live in the Future, Come Join Us" back in 2015 about the stand on the Mauna that was taking place. And that actually ended up in me getting a job from that. I became the content strategy lead for Kanaka, which is this network of Native Hawaiian kula and different orgs that do kind of Aina-based stuff and care about the Lahui. And so I was the content strategy lead, which meant I did a lot of their social media and digital media. I wrote all of their posts on Facebook. If you've ever seen Kanaka's stuff on Facebook, a couple years ago, everything was written mostly by me, all of the scripts for the videos and stuff like that. And then I also write dorky science fiction, which is kind of one of the things I really get excited about because it talks so much about the future. And I write in ʻŌiwi Hawaii or in English. This picture here where it says "All My Relations" is one of the stories that got republished recently in the Hawaii Review of Books. But that idea, the reason I do science fiction is because I think that our culture is so future oriented and so necessary for the future, and we always get dismissed as being of the past. Yeah, and so I think that's why it's important for us to really kind of push these things forward. Okay, so that's kind of just a quick introduction of myself. I wish I could see all of the rest of you. I just see right now I just see Kanani and Lance and Bianca's screens. But so I'm going to start my talk today, and it's called Kamana Unuhi. And as many of you know, the word Unuhi is the word for translation. And mana, we know that word mana, but besides the kind of way we know that normally as this kind of power, this spirit that we have, it also means version, right? It's when a tree branches off, that's a mana, or if a river kind of shifts in a different direction, that's a mana. So it also means a version of a mo'olelo, right? So and as we know, the more a story gets retold, the more mana it gets, right? So the most retold story is the one with the most mana, and that's not especially for us in our history, that's not always the Hawaiian version of the story, right? And so that's what I want to talk about today, how these stories kind of came to be and how there's different mana of our mo'olelo, but also of translation itself. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a little bit of a discussion about translation, because I think if you haven't done translation, it's really kind of tricky to understand, right? How translation actually works. And so what I want to start off with is these two phrases: nothing is translatable and everything is translatable, right? And it's this kind of oh, what the heck is that word? It's this I can't think of the word. But they don't agree with each other, right? They can't exist simultaneously and both be true, right? It's this kind of contradiction that's at the heart of translation. And that's actually the word I was looking for, was contradiction. And so what happens is that, we know that nothing really transfers exactly from one language to another, right? That's the thing that we always talk about, that idea of lost in translation. But it's also true that everything can be translated, right? Because everything that is in kind of human experience can be shared with other people, right? That's because otherwise, if we couldn't, there's no way to communicate with other cultures, right? There's no way to explain our experiences to other people, yeah? So everything is translatable, but also at the same time, nothing is translatable because it doesn't carry across accurately. And so that's a weird kind of contradiction that you have to hold in your mind while we talk about translation. And there's this Spanish philosopher named Jose Ortega y Gasset, and he says this, and I think this is something that we know this instinctually, but He says, since languages are formed in different landscapes through different experiences, their incongruity is natural, right? It means that, you know, we develop all of our languages develop in different aina, in different circumstances, in different cultures, and all of that, right? So even though we might be describing similar things, they're not going to be exactly the same, right? And so some people, they say that the only things that can actually be translated directly are proper names, geographic, scientific, and technical terms, days of the week, months, and numbers, right? But that doesn't even apply to Hawaiian, right? Because we have different days of the week, we have different months, you know, we have different ways of counting. So you can see that these things are not set up. There's no congruence between these separate languages when we kind of talk about things that are on one language transferring and traveling to another language. All right, and this is the thing that I think is the hardest to understand about translation. And that's that one of the biggest myths of translation is that you can do a literal translation. There's no such thing as a literal translation. And this is one of the bases of this talk, right? Because the reason you can't ever do a literal translation is that translation is always interpretation, right? You're always trying to say, okay, what's the best word that fits here, right? There's no exact kind of correlation between words, right? So it's not a mechanical process. That's why, like, sometimes if you've tried to use Google Translate to translate stuff into Hawaiian, it comes up with some really weird things sometimes, right? Because the AI, the artificial intelligence, is trying to figure out what you want to say, and it's not really that well trained. And so you are always reauthoring everything when you do translation. But so when people say that they're doing literal translation, a lot of them have these different ideas in mind. Like some people will say that they'll like, to do literal translation, you have to keep the order of words in the sentence the same as it was in the other language. Or some people say, oh, well, you have to use short words if they're using short words and long words if they're using long words, right? And these are all very weird, different ideas that people have in mind for translation, for literal translation, what it means to do literal translation. But what happens with that, though, is that when you're a reader and you see that somebody has done a literal translation, you think, oh, good, I'm getting the good translation, right? I'm not getting the made up stuff. I'm getting the one where they're actually telling me what the words mean. But that's not how translation works, right? Everything is an interpretation. Everything is a reauthoring. And so here on this little spectrum that I have here, there's two kinds of translation that people talk about. There's other types of translation as well. But what we talk about a lot is the idea of foreignizing translation or domesticating translation. And a foreignizing translation means that, like, when you translate it, you try to keep it weird, right? You try to keep it foreign so that people realize, okay, I'm reading something from another language. I'm reading something from another culture. And so it doesn't read as smoothly as you might see a translation that's considered domesticating. So a domesticating translation is one where, and these are like, and don't forget, these are opposite ends of the spectrum, right? Domesticating translations are where people will translate things into a context that the domestic audience, which is the, so let's say we're translating between Hawaiian and English, and we're translating into English, right? So if we're doing a domesticating translation, we are saying that we are translating everything into the English language context. And an example of that would be, let's say we get that ʻŌlelo no ʻeau, ika ʻŌlelo no keola, ika ʻŌlelo no kamake, right? It's a very famous ʻŌlelo no ʻeau. In language, there is life. In language, there is death. Yeah, we all know that one. And a domesticating translation might translate that as the pen is mightier than the sword, right? And it's not the same thing, but it gets kind of at a similar idea. And the people on the domesticating side, on the English language side, are more familiar with that phrase. And so they might be, you know, the way that Hawaiians are more familiar with ika ʻŌlelo no keola, ika ʻŌlelo no kamake. So because English language readers are more familiar with that phrase, that's the phrase that they will use. And this is when I lecture in my classes, this is where I stop and say, does that make sense to everybody? But I can't see anybody else. So if that, please feel free to write in the comments or the questions if that doesn't make sense. But that's what a domesticating translation is. And so there's no way to not do one of those things because you're picking stuff all the time, right? For example, like, you can't do literal translation. Like, let's say, aloha gets translated as love all the time, right? That's the one that we hear for it all the time. And it fits sometimes, but it doesn't fit all the time, right? And what it really means is that when people say that aloha equals love, it means that we as Hawaiians will act exactly the same as Westerners would act when we love something, right? And we know that's not true. We've seen that in our community struggles all the time, right? We love the aina, we aloha the aina in a particular way. And it's not the same as when people say that they love Hawaii, right? When people, so love and aloha do not just map onto each other exactly. And so that's why this idea of literal translation of even just the most basic words is impossible. Okay, so I have to avoid my desire to ask everybody if that makes sense to them because I can't see anybody. All right, but so moving into the actual, this is kind of the preview of what we're talking about in this presentation is why should we even pay attention to translation in Hawaiian history? Because, that is, and we shouldn't just pay attention to it because I study it, right? That's not a very interesting reason for that. But the reasons that we should pay attention to it include that translation was everywhere in the kingdom era, right? Kanaka traders interacted with sailors from across the sea. American missionaries preached to gathered crowds. Kua'aina from the countryside haggled with Chinese poi factory owners, right? And Hawaii was such a kind of meeting place because of its status as this kind of port of call. People, both Hawaiians and other people, spoke English, French, Russian, Greek, Tahitian, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and all these other languages, right? And so translation really was this part of the day-to-day life of so many people in the kingdom era. And I'm not going to talk about it in translation today, but the translation, in the presentation today, but the translation of the Bible was also this huge thing that took place, right? And we often see, we often present the Bible, the Hawaiian Bible, as this record of how Hawaiians spoke ʻŌlelo Hawaii at the time, right? Because it was translated with the help of so many really kind of amazing Kanaka scholars of the time. But what we don't pay attention to is that missionaries also made up hundreds of words in the Bible translation, right? So it can't be, so the first thing is that a translation can never be a record of our kind of thoughts and language use because it's bringing something else into our language. But it's also the fact that the missionaries made up a bunch of words, and like I said, I won't talk too much about that. And then also we had, English and Hawaiian laws, right? They're supposed to be, the English at one point was supposed to be the translation of the Hawaiian. And then it switched after a while, right? That the translation became the Hawaiian became the translation of the English. But we had to deal with this translation just in your day-to-day navigating life with these uses of the laws and stuff like that, yeah? So that is one of the reasons why we should pay attention to translation. The second is that it lays bare the power dynamics in colonial situations, right? And, we all know that Hawaii is under occupation. And so colonial isn't necessarily the word that we always use to talk about it, but it is a helpful thing to look at in terms of other indigenous situations, but also the way that colonialism and imperialism in the kingdom tried to establish a foothold and tried to establish this kind of power that they have during the kingdom era. Right? Because translation is never this one-way process. There's always kind of contestation going on. And that's what I'm talking about with the interpretations that people are doing, and they're shifting these languages and stuff like that. And if you pay attention to who's doing the translation and when and why, you really see who is kind of how the contest of power, how the balance of power is playing out in the kingdom. And like I said, this is a preview of stuff that we'll talk about in a little bit. So this is just kind of my trailer for the movie that we're going to be watching, which hopefully is not a box office bomb. And then the last thing is that it changes how we read our history, right? Because so much of our history was affected by translation, right? Because so many of us have, even though many of us can read ʻŌiwi Hawaii now, so many of us are still influenced by the translations of Kamako and Moʻolelo and John Papa ʻŌiwi and stuff like that, yeah? And if you pay attention to the audiences for those translations and the reasoning behind it and the way they were translated, kind of a lot of the stuff that Puake Nogemeyer talked about in his book, it really will change how you understand our history. And I'm gonna talk a little bit more about some of the more outside effects of that, not necessarily in the translation itself, but the audience and this kind of particular narrative that the people who translated these texts were invested in. There's a story that they were trying to tell about Hawaiians, and it's not one that really empowers us. Okay, so when we get into this, you see that translation is an indicator of cultural confidence and power, right? Because once Hawaiians start taking on translation, it's just like they translate whatever they want. They take anything they want and they put it into ʻŌiwi Hawaii. Yeah, because when translation was kind of first starting off, it was, like I said, in the Bible translation process, and there was only a few Hawaiians and missionaries that took part in that process. And then it was only ali'i and elected officials and some of the Lahaina Luna students who worked with translation for the law, right? But once we start printing the newspaper, right? That's what this is. This is what this picture is one of the old printing presses. And you can imagine having to print, several hundred pages of newspaper every day with one of those. It was really a labor of love. But so once Hawaiians started translating for the newspapers, they just started to flex, essentially. Like they were able to just do whatever they wanted. And the reason why they could translate without any fear was that they knew that ʻŌiwi Hawaii was supple enough to hold anything that the foreign world could bring in. Yeah, any story, any news story, any piece of literature, we could bring any of that into Hawaiian. And that was how confident we were, how confident our kupuna were in our ʻŌlelo that they would translate whatever they wanted without any fear, yeah? So yeah, once the newspapers start going, the newspapers, as you know, become this realm for learning, entertainment, grief, debate, and more, yeah? And so the translation was a huge role and played a huge role in the newspapers. Like they translated foreign news from places, a lot of English sources, but also French, German, and Chinese and other Pacific language materials. They would all bring that into ʻŌiwi Hawaii in the newspapers. Partially because they were businesses, right? And so you needed to fill up the newspaper. So you're like just scraping at times to like get that last, paragraph filled, that last two inches of the column filled with something, I feel like that reminds me of my students when, they have to write a 5-page paper and they're at like 4.5 pages and they're like, I don't know what to do for this last paragraph. But that was why Hawaiians used so many of whatever resources were available to them to fill up the newspapers and to do all of these things. And so, in Hawaiian hands, translation became a strategy for us asserting the power of ʻŌiwi Hawaii, right? And by extension of our culture and our history, to hold everything that the world had to offer. And it really became this powerful place for Hawaiians. And the missionaries knew, right? Everyone kind of gives missionaries credit for teaching Hawaiians literacy because they formalized the alphabet and stuff like that. But it really was Hawaiians who recognized the power of it and were like, this is what we're gonna do. We're gonna learn literacy. We're gonna be awesome at publishing and printing and stuff like that. And the missionaries and the establishment knew that things are getting out of their hands. Like they were losing control. So for example, in 1861, right? Many of you know, if you know about newspapers, a bunch of Kanaka, Maka'ainana, and ali'i started Kahokuokapaki Pika, right? The Star of the Pacific. And that's the kind of the first free press Hawaiian newspaper. It wasn't controlled by the mission. It wasn't controlled by the government. And it was this thing where Hawaiians were like, yes, now we can put whatever we want out. We can, all the stories we want to print, all of the news things we want to say, all of the editorials we want to print, all of our mana'o, it can be put out here. And what happened was the missionaries were like, nope, you guys are bad. So what happened was people were getting excommunicated from the church for subscribing to Kahokuokapaki Pika. People were getting kicked out from different groups and stuff like that. Surprisingly, John Papa'i'i was very against Kahoku Kapaki Pika. He stood up at one point and compared it to prostitution. You know, he said that that subscribing to Kahoku Kapaki Pika was as bad as prostitution. So you can see that really what was happening was that the missionaries could see that the genie was out of the bottle, right? That Hawaiians were in control and things were getting kind of sketchy for them, right? It was starting to undermine the foundations of their power. And Abraham Fornander, he was a newspaper guy as well. So he was the editor of the Polynesian at the time that Kahoku Kapaki Pika came out. And he was really pro Hawaiians being in the newspaper. And so he said, a mental revolution is going on among the native population, which the missionaries are equally incompetent to comprehend, to master, or to avert, and of which evidently the Hoku Kapaki Pika, which he calls the People's Journal, is more properly the result rather than the cause, right? So what's happening is Hawaiians are just like, we can't take this anymore. We need to run free and do our newspapers the way we want. And the missionary establishment is not happy with it. And this is something we'll see happening throughout the rest of the 19th century. Okay, and then so what we want to talk about here is this idea of lost in translation, right? Because it's something, I think it's the most widely held understanding of translation. But let me talk a little bit about how important the translation was to the newspapers, because I started to mention it already. But let me just kind of list some of the things that were affected by translation in the newspapers, right? So they had foreign news, right? Because Hawaiians were these very worldly people. Well, we are these very worldly people, but especially in the 19th century, they were concerned about what's happening in Ireland, what's happening in all these other parts of the world, yeah? Because that is something that mattered to them. So there was foreign news. There was also translation of foreign fiction and nonfiction. And it was kind of funny because I think a lot of you might have heard that, Shakespeare got translated into Hawaiian and all of these really kind of high literary texts got translated into Hawaiian. But also there was romance novels got translated into Hawaiian, those really kind of pulpy ones that you would probably see at the bookstore where there's the shirtless guy with the long hair and then he's holding the woman and she's got her dress is kind of down and stuff like that. That's what Hawaiians were reading that in the newspaper too. That and detective stories and stuff like that. So, the newspapers were just this really kind of great channel almost, right? It's like the Netflix of the time, people were watching all these different things and watching foreign movies and stuff like that. And so besides the stories and stuff, they would have laws and proclamations and other treaties from countries that would appear in Hawaiian and English, so people knew what was happening. And even the advertisements, right? If you haven't looked at the newspapers, they got funny advertisements. There's the Michelin Man in them and stuff like that. The guy made out of tires and stuff and who knew that he was, there back in the early 1900s and stuff like that. So the advertisements were translations as well. And the newspapers would critique each other for their translation because translation was so important. So Kahoku Kapaki Pika called out Kamakakūokalani for a really crappy translation that they did. And then Hawaiians themselves would scrap about translation. And there's this example that I love to use is there's this series of letters that people wrote to the newspaper, and it went on for months. And it's started by this guy named G.M. Koha, and what they are arguing about is translating between Hawaiian, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. And it gets so heated, they're so angry and they're making fun of each other's genealogies and stuff and saying, you're so stupid, you don't even realize that your Hebrew sucks. They're having all of these beefs. It's kind of like social media now. People are scrapping, but about translating classical European texts, right? So it's this thing of this really highly elevated discourse that's going on in the newspapers at the time. But what we always hear about translation is that things are lost in translation. So here I have this quote from Larry Kimura, and I think it really kind of gets at the point of what we are talking about when we say that things are lost in translation, right? So he says descriptions of the indigenous Hawaiian aesthetic culture and base culture through the medium of the imposed English language cannot absolutely transmit a full picture of Hawaiian culture, right? I know you all can read, but I'm reading it out loud so I can put emphasis on certain things. And this is the part here. So English inevitably implies Anglo-American culture in direct proportion to the part of Hawaiian culture that is lost in the description. This has a negative impact on Hawaiians, not only in the impression gained by outsiders, but also in the self-impression gained by English-speaking Hawaiians using such descriptions, right? So what that, that's the thing that we hear is, right, when people translate stuff from ʻŌlelo Hawaii into English, they're not getting a full picture of the Hawaiian. And that's true, right? There is a loss in translation sometimes. But there's also other things that happen during translation. You can gain things, you can shift meaning, you can re-emphasize certain things, you can reframe things, you can hide things, or you can even reinvigorate things, right? So there's this idea that actually things are gained in translation as well. And so I want to shift Larry Kimura's thing, and I'm not saying he's wrong. I actually agree. I do agree with him, but I want to shift it and make it look at the Hawaiian situation a little bit more, right? And if you shift some of the words he's using, it says, because the medium of the Hawaiian language cannot absolutely transmit a full picture of Anglo-American culture, it follows that ʻŌlelo Hawaii inevitably implies Hawaiian culture in direct proportion to what of Anglo-American culture is lost. So what that means, I feel like, is that when we translate these foreign things into ʻŌlelo Hawaii, it brings it into a Hawaiian understanding and a Hawaiian worldview, right? Because of the added connotations that come with our language. And it shifts those foreign values closer to our own values about Aina, Ea, Lahui, Kanaka, and Ohana. Like all of the things that we hold dear, these foreign stories are shifted much closer to our hearts that way. Yeah. And that's not to say that bringing something into ʻŌlelo Hawaii automatically makes it Hawaiian, right? Because we know that's not true. But I think it does bring it into our sphere of understanding and our sphere of influence. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit more now. So we have Kamana Moʻolelo. This is, right, all the different versions of the story. And we know that in the newspapers, because this is what we've been studying, we as scholars have been studying our Moʻolelo in the newspapers. And that's one of the amazing things about the newspapers, right, is it was such a repository for our Moʻolelo. And we go to them for inspiration, right, and cultural information. And one thing I do want to mention too is that the authors of these Mo'olelo in the newspaper, we really shouldn't see them just as vessels of the oral tradition, because I think that's something that we think sometimes about people writing in the newspaper. Like Kamaka was just channeling the oral tradition and presenting it to us, or Joseph Poi Poi was just presenting the story as he had heard it, because they are all actually authors in their own right, and they're writing these Mo'olelo. Because if you track a Mo'olelo through the newspapers, even the traditional ones, the story changes, not the story, but the style of telling the story changes. So you see that Hawaiians were actually developing this beautiful literary Hawaiian throughout the 19th century. And so like at the end of the 19th century, people were pushing these boundaries and really doing really interesting stuff with ʻŌlelo Hawaii and telling Mo'olelo, like Kahikina Kelekona and some of the other folks that you folks might already know. They were really creating this this aesthetic, this Hawaiian literary aesthetic, like a written aesthetic that was different than an oral tradition, right? And so that's something that we should pay attention to when we look at these Mo'olelo. But the reason I'm talking about them is that, we know to go to the newspapers for inspiration from these Mo'olelo, but we don't necessarily know to go to the newspapers for inspiration from these Mo'olelo, from the foreign stories. And that, I think, is an interesting thing, because when we pay attention to how translation works, you'll see that there's some kind of interesting things that Hawaiian translators were doing with these stories. So, we know that there's all these translated stories. So this one is Tarzan, and then this one is Kamakani Ino, which is a translation of Shakespeare's Tempest. And I think it's funny that the Hawaiian name for Shakespeare is Ho'onawewe Ihe, which literally means to shake a spear. And then this last story that we're actually going to talk about is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Like, I don't think most of you, if you've seen that old movie or know, are familiar with 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, I don't think you probably didn't expect that we were going to talk about that in a Hawaiian context today, yeah? But that is what we're going to do. So 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was translated by a young man named G.W. Kanuha, right? And that was a translation of Jules Verne's hugely popular novel. Like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was like this worldwide blockbuster that got translated into all these other languages. And it was published in French in 1870. Right, and so Kanuha's translation begins to appear in 1875, which is a pretty quick turnaround if you think about, like, you know, shipping times and all of that, how fast it took, how long it probably took to get 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea to Hawaii, and then how quickly Kanuha translated it. And he translated the whole thing. And the sad thing is, just like I guess just like a lot of our other kupuna, he passed away at age 31 before the whole translation was published. But he was known, you know, and I think had he lived, he would have been this really well-known literary person, you know. And so that's why I do like to mention his name and his story a little bit, so that people hear it a little bit more. But so in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, if you're not familiar with it, it's the story about Captain Nemo and a couple of guys who go on his submarine called the Nautilus, and they end up in all these adventures, essentially. But in the English-speaking world, Captain Nemo is seen as a cynic, this guy who kind of hates people, right? Because he attacks civilian and military warships, and he funds these revolutions and stuff like that. So he's like disgusted with society. He's like this really he's like a terrorist, essentially. And that's how he gets portrayed in these English language versions. But once you look at Kanuha's translation, and actually if you look at the original French, things are much different, and it actually gets a little bit closer to Aloha Aina in that way. So this is Captain Nemo and several of the ways that he's been portrayed over time. I think this is the classic movie version right here. I don't know if you can see my mouse moving, but he's a white guy, right? He's very clearly a white dude that sails his submarine, the Nautilus, and stuff like that. You know, he's kind of like this handsome model looking guy on this side. But the truth of the matter is that in the original French, Captain Nemo was actually this guy named Prince Dakar. And Dakar was an Indian man whose family was killed in the 1857 uprising against the East India Company. And so there's a sequel to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea called The Mysterious Island, right? And so they describe Nemo's background in The Mysterious Island a little bit. And the translator says that Nemo is, quote, Indian in his heart, Indian in his longing for revenge, Indian in his dreams of reclaiming his native land, driving out the invaders, and inaugurating a new era of independence, right? So this is a very anti-colonial kind of character that we have going on here that really got kind of flattened out and whitewashed into a haole guy. And so in Kanuha's story, he portrays the Nautilo, which is the Hawaiianization of the Nautilus, as Dakar or Nemo's Aina, right? And what he does is he really invites people to see this submarine as a metaphor for Hawaii, and Captain Nemo as an Aloha Aina who is fighting for his ea, for his kuoko'a, or his independence. And the reason that you can see that happening is because, like I said, translation is a process of interpretation. So if you look at the original text and compare it with the translation, you can see where Kanuha made these changes that really shift how the story is understood. So this version of the story, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, it comes out in the midst of these fierce debates about the Reciprocity Treaty, right? And if you're not familiar with the Reciprocity Treaty, it's this free trade agreement, right, that would let sugar from Hawaii enter the U.S. duty-free, right? So that it would make Hawaiian sugar competitive with American sugar. And so the thing that made that debate so fraught, though, was that in return for that reciprocity treaty, the United States wanted to take control of Pu'uloa, right, and make it their deep draft harbor. And so most Hawaiians were against that idea, right? Joseph Nava, he would always make all of these really impassioned, beautiful speeches saying that we can't let any piece of our aina be under foreign control, right? And you see these debates being echoed in Kanuha's translation of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, right? So when Captain Nemo first meets these people who come onto his ship, they kind of end up not shipwrecked, but they end up almost like prisoners on his ship. And so he tells them, well, hiki mai o koe, ho'opili kia wale I ko'u aupuni me ko'u noho ana. Right? You have come to trouble my aupuni and my lifestyle. Right? And because the Nautilo, the Nautilus, is Nemo's aupuni, his government, his nation, he won't accept any threats to it. Right? And Kanuha really changed that scene because, we know aupuni is that word for government or nation. And in the original French, Vernes actually just used the word existence, right? Which is the French word for, in English, it's existence. So he said, in an English translation would be, you've come to trouble my existence, right? But in the ʻŌiwi Hawaii, he's saying, you've come to make trouble to my aupuni and my lifestyle and my culture, yeah? Aranaxa, who is the other guy that is a prisoner on the ship, is on the ship, he says about Nemo, "A'ole ona panawai pili la hui wale no kana I kaupale aku ai. Ua ho'olilo maoli no iai iho he haku kuoko'a no kona mau mana'o. I ka'aloa aku ma waho o nā palena o ko ke au I āpono ai, a ma waho ho'i o nā palena o ko la ko mana." And so that translates something along the lines of, it was not merely the laws relating to la hui that he refuted. He had truly turned himself into a haku, or a lord, or a boss, right? We know what haku means. He had truly turned himself into a haku with ku'oko'a based on his own desires. He is beyond what the world at large deems appropriate, and he is free from the boundaries of their mana, right? So you see again with this this usage of ku'oko'a and being in charge of your own independence, it really shifts this understanding of the story, especially with, the Paulette affair, when that rogue British captain came and took over Hawaii for 6 months in 1843. That's still in everyone's living memory, right? That's just 2 decades previous. And the United States is encroaching on Hawaiian air through the Reciprocity Treaty, right? So we see that Nemo here is kind of embodying the kind of weary, right? The tired aloha aina who is kind of worn down by this constant struggle, but is still resolute in the fact that he's going to stand up for his ku'oko'a. He's going to stand up for his aina and his aupuni. And then the last kind of quote that we have from Nemo here is this kind of speech that he gives. This is really where he's exhorting the people in the story, right? So he's making the speech to the people in the story, but you can hear how Kanuha wants Nemo to be making this speech to Kanaka as well, yeah? And he says, e noho I loko ka poli o nā wai. Malaila wale no e lo ai ya oe ke kuoko'a. Malaila ike ai au, a ohe mau haku maluna iho o'u. Malaila o lana kilo wau. And so he says, indeed, live. You must live within the bosom of the waters. It is only there where you will find kuoko'a. It is there that I found no lord to be over me. There I was victorious. Right. So again, for Hawaiian readers, this idea of living in the waters, in the sea, is more, I think, would connect them to aina, right? Live in this aina, live connected to our aina, and that is where you will find ku'oko'a. That is where you will find that no lord can be over you as long as you hold on to your aina, yeah? And all of the things that make us Hawaiian. So you see that Kanuha is using Nemo almost as like a puppet, right? To say these things, to exhort people to take a stand for aina, to stand against the fact that we're trying to give away pu'uloa to U.S. control. And this is a strategy that Hawaiians used all the time, right? Because this was a chance to, people have their guard down. If if it was a speech by Joseph Nawahi, if you were against the idea, you're not going to listen to Joseph Nawahi. But if you're just kind of sitting there and you're listening to this really cool story about a submarine, and there's, if you remember the movie, there's like a giant octopus that's like fighting the submarine and stuff like that, right? So if you're thinking of a story like that, your guard is down more, and these ideas about aloha aina would kind of shift into you more, yeah. So this gets published in Kamakakūokalani, which was edited by Whitney, which, if you know newspapers, it was kind of seen as an establishment newspaper that was meant to more assimilate Hawaiians to Haole ways of thinking. And so Whitney probably saw the publication of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea as like, oh, good, this is this blockbuster of the time, and it'll get people to pay for the newspaper and to, read our paper. Whereas Kanuha was like, I'm going to make a statement about the Reciprocity Treaty. I'm going to make a statement about Aloha Aina. Yeah. So you can imagine how this is not the only example of it. This happened hundreds and thousands of times per issue of newspaper. And if you multiply that out across the 100 years that Hawaiian newspapers were existing, you can see how much of our cultural values and the kind of foundational beliefs and inspiration that still can stand for us today is within those stories, even these foreign stories that you wouldn't necessarily think of looking at for Aloha Aina, right? I mean, because if people talk about Aloha Aina, they're not going to be like, yeah, I want to be an Aloha Aina like Captain Nemo, right? But that is really what Kanuha was trying to create. And when you think about this, the fact of how people used translation and just regular words and Olelo Hawaii, the newspapers became this huge threat, right? This is, I would say, a picture of 6 of the most dangerous people in the kingdom at the time, right? I mean, and there are many more. There aren't pictures of them. I couldn't find pictures of some of the other newspaper editors, right? But like, I feel like when we think of dangerous people in the kingdom, maybe we think of Wilcox because he led an armed revolt and stuff like that. But if you really pay attention to the way the newspapers worked, these were the dangerous people. It was the newspaper editors. It was the people who used their olelo to really kind of get things going. And we'll talk a little bit about how the newspapers directly led to the 1895 counter revolt. So just to name, if you don't know all of these folks, right, we have Joseph Nawahi over here, John Bush. John Bush was this really, I feel like he doesn't get that much credit nowadays, but he was this really kind of amazing Olelo Hawaii sovereignty kind of theoretician. Okay, I don't know how to pronounce that word. That is the word that I'm trying to think of. I could spell it, but I can't say it at the moment. Theoretician. Maybe is that right? Okay. Anyways, but he was known for his kind of the ways he would approach protecting Hawaiian sovereignty and asserting Hawaiian independence and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. And then this is Robert Wilcox over here, right? Who was schooled in Italy as part of Kalakaua Study Abroad program. This is Emma Nawahi, which I don't think, she looks so friendly. She doesn't seem like she'd be dangerous, but she was freaking dangerous. And here Kahikina Kelekona sitting on this very kind of fancy chair, right? Again, these are not dangerous looking people, but Kelekona was, if you don't know about Kelekona, he was just this amazing literary person. And I don't have time to go into all of the cool stuff he did, but if you know about him or if you don't know about him, you should really find out more because he was just doing all of these amazing things with Olelo Hawaii at the time and English actually. And then this last person is Joseph Poi Poi. Who, again, did so many really interesting things. And so these folks, so like Nawahi and Bush and some of these other guys, they were 19 years old when Kahoku Kapaki Pika gets published, right? So they're growing up in this time when literacy is something that's always been around them. It's not something that the missionaries introduced. It's something that Hawaiians did, right? It's a literary practice. It's a traditional practice that we as Hawaiians did. And that's how they grew up. And that's why that's how they were able to grow into these powerhouses of literature, and literature doesn't seem to always equal political action, but that's really how it works in the kingdom. And so while things are happening, like the bayonet constitution is going on, and Hawaiian kind of political power is being really kind of curtailed, and ʻŌiwi Hawaii is declining in usage and stuff like that. You know, you see a lot of kind of constraints being put on Hawaiian political and legal power during this time. But in the newspapers, Hawaiians were unmatched. There was no contesting Hawaiian power in the newspapers. And that was a threat. That was the big threat to the establishment. It was the big threat to the people who are trying to overthrow our government. You know, because people think that, like, oh, well, the English newspapers must have been big too. No, the Hawaiian newspapers murdered them in terms of, like, how many people bought the newspaper, how many people read it, who was writing stuff. There were way more Hawaiian newspapers than English, all of that stuff, yeah? And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about why these newspapers were such a threat and why the newspaper editors were such a threat. So during this really tumultuous time, closer to the end of the 19th century, translation becomes this even more important tool for the Nupepa Aloha Aina, right? All the folks who are pushing for our ea and our lahui. And so Ho'i Holomua, which was edited on the Hawaiian side by the guy sitting in the chair, Kahikina Kelekona, right? That nice little fancy chair. They printed Lili'uokalani's protest and her appeal to Cleveland in both Hawaiian and English after the overthrow. And then after the formation of the Hui Aloha Aina, many of its resolutions and memorials were also printed in the newspapers in both Hawaiian and English, again, deploying translation for Hawaiian purposes. For example, this resolution here on the side, on the right-hand side, was put out by the Hui Aloha Aina right on the eve of the formation of the Republic, right? And it talked about why they were against it. And now, if you think about it, though, why are they printing the English, right? Because these are Hawaiian newspapers. And, you know, some of the foreigners were for sure on the side of Hawaiians. Actually, a lot of the foreigners were on the side of Hawaiians, and so they would read the English. But I would also say that the audience for their English translations wasn't necessarily here in Hawaii, right? Because they weren't necessarily going to change the minds of the Committee of Safety people or the people who were running the Republic and stuff like that, right? They knew, though, that the Hawaiian newspapers were making their ways to San Francisco and Washington, D.C. So they knew that if they translated these things and put them in the newspapers in English, that American politicians could read them and know that Hawaiians were really not on board with the overthrow, really not on board with the Republic, really not on board with annexation and stuff like that, yeah? So again, Hawaiians are using all of these tools for their purposes, their own kind of political purposes. And what you find out is that these words, these newspaper editors become so dangerous that their words are as powerful as guns and bombs. And that's a literal understanding that the Republic gets. And I'll talk about that a little bit. So this picture is of the National Guard, right? This is the people that the Republic hired to fight off all of the interior kind of revolts that were going on. So it's made up of like the Honolulu Rifles and other kind of like mercenaries that they hired and stuff like that. But the newspapers became such a thorn in the side of the Republic that when they pushed their new constitution on Hawaiians, the first version of Article 3, which was on freedom of speech, read like this. I'm going to read it out loud to you. It says, except as herein provided, all men may speak freely. No, all men may freely speak, write, and publish their sentiments on all subjects, right? So that's a normal kind of freedom of speech kind of thing, right? You have the freedom to say whatever you want, except, and no law shall be enacted to restrain the liberty of speech or the press, right? So that's a normal kind of freedom of speech, freedom of the press kind of thing. But the Republic Constitution goes on to say, but all persons shall be responsible for the abuse of such right, and no person shall advocate by writing, printing, or speaking the restoration or establishment of a monarchical form of government in the Hawaiian Islands, nor advocate the use of force for the accomplishment of any change in the system or form of government hereby established, nor seek or advocate the action of any foreign power for such purpose, except by treaty duly made in accordance with the provisions of this Constitution. Right? So they're saying, you got free speech, unless you're against us, unless you're trying to get the kingdom back, then you don't have free speech. Then you're not allowed to say these things. And the messed up thing is all of the things that they say that you can't do under this free speech law is exactly what they did to overthrow the kingdom, right? That's all of the messed up stuff they did. And so they try to outlaw that with this freedom of speech law. And really, I think this is an example of what people, people all the time are like, well, Hawaii would have gotten taken over by somebody anyways. You guys should be happy you're not speaking Japanese. All of that weird kind of understanding that people have. But really, this idea that the Republic would put this in their constitution shows that it was such a close thing that nobody knew. The Republic themselves didn't know if they were going to be able to pull it off. This was not a done deal, right? And it's still not a done deal, right? But the Republic was afraid of the newspapers. Like, they were quaking because the newspapers represented, according to Helen Chapin, who's this really amazing newspaper scholar, the newspapers represented about 85% of the population, right? So the government, they were not supported by the public, and they didn't really have a legal standing either, right? As we know. So what they would do is they would just arrest anybody that they could, anybody who was speaking out against them. So what happens is newspaper editors were just getting arrested all the time. Kelikona, right, the guy sitting in the nice chair, he was charged and fined for libel. G. Carson Kenyon, who is this British guy who was also an editor of Hawaii Holomua, he was charged with criminal libel. Edmund Norrie, another editor of Hawaii Holomua, he was fined for seditious libel, right? So you see that they're just like, well, that's regular libel, and this is criminal libel, and that's seditious libel. And so they try to put them in prison. And then 6 months after the declaration of the Republic, Nawahi and Bush get arrested, and they're jailed on charges of sedition and fomenting rebellion, right? And so they're in jail for like a couple of weeks. And then they get arrested again when the 1895 counter revolt happens, right? And if you don't know, right, the 1895 counter revolt was an attempt to promulgate this new constitution that Charles Gulick had written and restore Liliʻuokalani to the throne, right? And it was this really large force of multi-ethnic people, right? There was Greek people, Chinese people, Japanese people, other Pacific Islanders, and then, all of them along with Hawaiians who were fighting for the ea of the Lahui. And so what happened was the plot was uncovered a little bit early. So Sam Nolan and Robert Wilcox had to set everything in motion too early. They weren't able to set things in motion the way they wanted to. So they got into this huge firefight, these battles that took place across Oahu, and there was like cannons and stuff like that, right? It was this really brutal fight, and over 300 people were arrested. And what happened is that along with these armed revolutionaries, right, people who were literally fighting for the kingdom, the next day they arrested all of the newspaper editors, right? So Edmund Norrie, Daniel Logan, E.C. Crick, Thomas Tamaki Spencer, W.J. Kapi, J.K. Kaunamano, G.C. Kenyon, F.J. Testa, Nawahi, Bush, all of these guys were put in jail next to the armed revolutionaries, right? Because that's how much people were afraid of the newspapers. And interestingly, Bush and Norrie had the most arrests. They got arrested in a 2-year period, they got arrested 5 times each. Right. And so that's, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous how many times people are getting arrested. And we know that, right? There's people in our Lahui now that get arrested that many times for doing the same kind of work. But so it really was writing and translation that led to these uprisings, right? So E.G. Hitchcock, who's the Marshal of the Republic, one of the people who was fighting for the Republic, he said, revolutions are not started these days without the aid of newspapers. And the way that, what's funny though, is that Hawaiians would use translation to get out of jail, right? Because there's these very strict laws about what they can and cannot say in the newspapers. And what they do is that they would just say, I think you're translating that wrong. I didn't say that we should have an armed revolt about, and try to overthrow the government. I was talking about flowers. Or I was talking about, these birds that were gathering together to to have, you know, this nice bird gathering, right? So what would happen was the newspaper editors would get arrested, and then they would go to trial, and then they would just say, well, you just translated that wrong. You really misunderstood what I was saying. And so they would get let free. And so there was this kind of revolving door of arrests that would take place. And so, yeah, it just really, I think these examples show how powerful translation was, but how powerful our stories were, right? And translation, I think, is a part of that. Okay, and I'm just gonna have this, okay, I'm not gonna talk about Act 57. I don't wanna go on for too much longer. I'm just gonna talk about this last kind of era of extractive translation, because that really kind of gets into the way that the translations that most of us are familiar with was produced. And I'll just go over it quickly. And so if you do have any questions about it, because I think I've been talking for just about an hour now, you can ask it in the Q&A or something like that, right? So this time, the territorial period between 1900 and 1955 was this golden era of what we call extractive translation. Because what happened was they weren't translating for Hawaiians anymore, right? Translation had been done by Hawaiians for the entirety of the Kingdom era. And now it was being done for Haole scholars. That's what these books are for, right? These were not translated for Hawaiians, even though we were allowed to read them, and we read them very much today. They were not translated for us, and we didn't have a hand in shaping how these translations were done. And so I think the last thing I'll tell you about is these translations. Well, there's two things. The translations were all published by the Bishop Museum, right? Through their anthropology department. And if you folks know who was on the board of trustees of the Bishop Museum during that time, it really looks like the Committee of Safety, right? So Sanford B. Dole was the president of the board of trustees for the Bishop Museum. William O. Smith, another big part of the Committee of Safety, was his vice president. Samuel Damon was a trustee. W.D. Alexander, the Department of Education head, who felt that the extinction of ʻŌiwi Hawaii would benefit Hawaiians, he was also a museum trustee when the translation of David Malo was published, right? So all of these people who overthrew the kingdom and jailed Hawaiians for speaking out against them were presiding over the institution that decided which Hawaiian language text would be translated to represent Hawaiians as a people. Right? And so that is why it is really not surprising that none of those texts talk about any of the tumultuous decades at the end of the 19th century, right? There is nothing about the overthrow from a native voice that got translated by the Bishop Museum. There's nothing about the Bayonet Constitution and stuff like that. Yeah, so you can see what they were trying to do. And then this last thing that I think I want to talk about is that the translators were invested in creating a particular narrative of ancientness about Hawaiians. And the reason was because they were scholars. They were trying to build this new field of study that was called Hawaiian Studies, right? It's just not the kind of Hawaiian studies we have now, right? It was Hawaiian studies made by Haole people. And they really were trying to get more prestige for their field. They had to present this story of ancientness, right? Because the longer history your field had, then the more kind of prestigious it would be. And so they really followed the translation model set up by things like these books over here, these red and green books. They're called the Loeb Classical Library. It's these translations of Latin and Greek texts. And they really tried to follow that because that was kind of the prestigious thing to do at the time. And so that's why you'll see people would do, like Dorothy Barrera, she decided to put all of Kamakau in past tense, right? So Kamakau is very careful to write what, Hawaiians do this now, they used to do this, we don't really do it as much now. These practices are ongoing, these practices are not really ongoing, these practices are in danger. But Dorothy Barrera, she decided as editor, she would put everything in past tense to make it easier to read, right? And so that literally relegates Hawaiians to the past. And that idea has really kind of influenced how we look at our own history, right? We talk about ancientness all the time. When I was in taking Papaʻolelo Hawaii as an undergrad, whenever we had to tell a story about anything, we always started with Ika wa Kahiko, right? In times of old. There was a news story a while back about tools that were stolen from a fish pond, and the news kept describing it as an ancient Hawaiian fish pond, even though it's still in use right now. And yes, the walls are ancient and the traditions are ancient, but it's a living, thriving, vibrant thing that is living now, you know. And for example, we see another thing, then this is the last thing I'll say, because I'm going over time a little bit. The last thing I'll say is that, you know, we see that Hawaiian stuff is always connected with the past and with just land-based kind of things. And for example, like there's that, you know, UH has that new strategic plan that's coming out where they're calling themselves an Aloha Aina University, right? And there's people against it and there's people for it. And I don't really want to say too much about that part of it. But the thing that really irritates me about it, besides some of the other stuff, the thing that really irritates me about it is that they talk about how important Hawaiian cultural values are for sustainability and for Aina and stuff like that. But they don't talk about how important Hawaiian cultural values are when they're talking about innovation and all of this technological change that they want to usher into Hawaii. And if you look at our practices of translation and literacy, you see that Hawaiians picked up this new technology in this amazing short amount of time, right? In just a generation, they went from not knowing literacy to universal literacy, right? That's like people seeing a computer one day and then the next generation, everybody knows how to create artificial intelligence, right? And so really we should see this as innovation. We should see our culture as innovation, not necessarily just as ancient, right? And that's where this story, the way these translations have happened, that's how that affects even the stories we tell about ourselves. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there. I'm gonna say mahalo nui for listening. If anybody has questions, I really invite questions. I don't know if I have answers, but thank you all very much for listening. Bianca, I can't hear you. I don't know if
I'm sorry, can you hear me now? Great, okay. So I'll start from questions that started earlier from Alpa Sridharan. Can y'all share a link or title of the author's publication that got him a job? Do you remember mentioning that earlier? You're unmuted now. Well, maybe I can unmute you.
Oh, there we go. There. No, I'm sorry. I will Google that right now. But you can ask me the other question while I'm Googling it.
Okay. Nakaua e pale me ka'ihe. You talked about high pressure stakes involved with translating legal documents. Are you familiar with the Makila Land Company versus Kamakakūokalani decision or other developers who hire expert witnesses to disenfranchise Kanaka Maoli owners of Kuleana Land Commission awards?
No, see, that's, yeah, I definitely, once I stopped doing legal, I mean, once I saw kind of how some of the legal documents were being, because I mean, it wasn't like, well, it was, so some Kanaka were approaching me to translate legal documents once they found out I translated legal documents. And I still do those if people ask, but I stopped doing it. You know, I was this young translator and there was this kind of, I had taken the legal document translation class with Puakea and stuff like that, but it just became clear that it wasn't, I don't think, a kind of translation that I wanted to be involved in. But so yeah, so I haven't been following these kinds of things that have been going on though, yeah.
Okay. And Wainani Lee, now that you mentioned all this is kind of earlier, do you think Kapihe was Hermes? I don't know, Hermetic Principle chant, and as above, so below. I might have to, I'll throw that into the chat if that's helpful.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, because I don't quite.
I'd probably mispronouncing things.
Oh, I could use a little bit more context for that. I'm not exactly sure what. I'm not familiar with the Hermetic Principle.
Okay.
So.
Maybe. You know, you can go back to and respond if you have time for like some of the comments or people maybe can like add more, and that tends to work as well. This is from MJ Patino. From a Makavalu perspective, taking ʻike from diverse sources, isn't this act culturally centered and valued by Kanaka? This is around when you're talking about the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea translation.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing, and that's the reason why I brought up the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, because I feel like we don't always see these foreign stories as seeds for that kind of approach, right? We don't really, people don't do Papaku Makavalu on Captain Nemo or something like that, right? I mean, so I do think that bringing this in and showing how Kanaka were really kind of enfolding these stories into our worldview, I think that is important, and I do think that's it makes it more open to these kinds of things. Yeah, so I mean, I think that is a powerful cultural value that we have, and I don't think we always applied it to these foreign things though, because it's like, yeah, what are we gonna get from the Hawaiian version of Shakespeare,
Okay. So Jamie Moana Singh Kawauchi asked, Western Hawaiian speaking judges were not polole to our Kanaka, Maui, ʻŌlelo, Hawaii, thus were not accurate in fair land decrees. Why were they not corrected?
So I have a little bit of stuff about that, but I do think that some of the legal minds around us are going to know, around me, are going to know better than I am. But I mean, I do think that you see, especially like Robertson, who was the Supreme Court justice in the kingdom, right? And he was a gold miner. Like, I don't even know how he ended up as Supreme Court justice, right? He was a gold miner, but he had this idea that it's called the genealogical axiom, where law could only come from the language that it was from, right? So he had this idea that law only came from English. And so he saw any of the Hawaiian laws as just interpretations of the English. So the English was kind of this all-standing original. And the Hawaiian was, of course, just a translation of it, even though many of the laws, right, as we know, were written in Hawaiian first. So some of his decisions, I think, really kind of show how that idea, that mistaken idea, in the hands of just a few people, right? Because the judiciary was, I feel like the judiciary was a lot more haole than the legislature was, in terms of who, in terms of makeup, who got elected and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I would say that because it's stuff like that. There was, fewer power in fewer hands. And Robertson especially had that really weird idea about law, and he made some decisions that were really affected by that, and I don't want to say too much about it with like folks like Bianca and Lance right here on the screen with me, because I'm sure they know way more about it than I do. But I do think translation played a part in it too, like kind of false understandings of translation came into play, because Robertson had a history of having weird ideas about translation as well.
Okay, we have a few more questions. This is from Ha'alilio Solomon, and his question is, if he warped the original text via his translation, can you say something about how Kanuha may have reconciled his literary manipulation with his ethical professional responsibilities? Ethical/professional. Here, I'll drop that into the chat.
Well, so that's the thing, is I feel like, do we have an ethical responsibility to not shift the Mo'olelo at all, right? Because I think if you understand translation as interpretation, no matter what you do, you can't really say that I'm not going to change this story at all, right? And so, and that's really what happens with literary translation, right? This is very different for legal translation. Legal translation, if you kind of are like, well, I'm going to reinterpret this how I want, then you go to court, right? You end up in front of a judge. But I would say that for Kanuha, this is the story he wanted to tell, and this is a story that he felt was a seed. There was a seed of that story in Verne's original, right? Because Verne did write Nemo as this anti-colonial person. It wasn't until it was translated into English that got stripped away. And so what I think is that Kanuha pruned things and he shifted things a little bit to make the story tell the story and give mana to the story that he cared more about, right? Because that really is what happens when you do literary translation, right? you really emphasize the things that you care about more. You kind of tell the story a little bit more in a way that's connected to you. And in terms of professional responsibility, I mean, if, you know, again, if he was a legal translator, I think there's a different kind of understanding going on there. But I would say that there's not as much of a professional core of translators with an understanding of there's these ethical and moral obligations that we have with translation, right? Because a lot of the translators were the newspaper editors. They were not hired to do that as a different job, right? There was, I mean, translator was a huge job in the kingdom, and it was one of the highest paying jobs in the kingdom. Although it's often given to Haole people. But I don't think that they had the same understanding of professional responsibility that maybe translators would have today. But having said that, I do think literary translators don't have that similar kind of responsibility. And that's what you really see in other contexts. I feel like in the Hawaiian context, you don't see that as much because we only have one translation of each thing. There's only one translation of Moʻolelo. Well, there's a couple of translations of Moʻolelo, and then there's only one translation of Kamakakūokalani. There's only one translation of John Papa ʻŌiwi. But if we had 10 different translations of each of those things, you would really see how these things start to shift, even if people aren't trying to tell their own story with it, right? It is just how you are understanding it. So translation is a reauthoring all the time, no matter what. And I don't think there's a way that you can do translation without shifting the meaning of a text. And that's why I said literal translation is not possible. But that is a good question. I would definitely like to hear more from Leo later, if you have a follow-up too.
Yeah, a lot of questions coming in. Can you talk about the value of continuing to translate stories / information into English for the generations that were not raised with Hawaiian being spoken in the family, with kula kanaiapuni, or with community or university language classes?
Yeah, I mean, so that is why I got into translation, was because you know, in my own family, my mom's generation didn't learn any ʻŌlelo Hawaii. My grandparents didn't want to teach it to them. And my mom hates this part of the story, but she would ignore my kupuna when he would speak Hawaiian sometimes. But, you know, she's a little kid. I don't think she understood that that's so bad. But I do think that's why we should do translation when we do translation, because people were, by no fault of their own, denied this opportunity to learn ʻŌlelo Hawaii, right? People who fought for who laid the groundwork for us, for these generations to be able to learn ʻŌlelo Hawaii, were not able to learn ʻŌlelo Hawaii themselves, right? And they still have that thirst, right? We all have that desire to get our mo'olelo. And so I do think that if there is a need for that, because I actually feel like that need has lessened a little bit, but I do think that if there is a need for that, then we should keep translating these stories. But I think we should also know what goes into translation. And that's why I do think it's important to understand translation as interpretation. You're not necessarily getting the exact same story that you would if you'd read it in ʻŌlelo Hawaii. Right now, we kind of know that. But even if we are ethically and morally dedicated to providing a translation as close to the culturally appropriate version as possible, it's still changing the story, right? It's still going to be different. But if you understand that, I think then we can have a really useful and vibrant relationship with translation, because I think there are people who are against translation for a good reason. People say that translating text takes you away from language revitalization. And it does in certain ways, but it also doesn't, right? I mean, like, that's how you lure people in. If we have no access to these texts and we don't have access to classes, right? It costs money. It takes time to learn ʻŌlelo Hawaii. And some of us can't afford that time or that money. So I would say we can't deny people those avenues. But I also don't think that our efforts should only be leaning towards translation. I like when we write new things. I like when we create new things in ʻŌlelo Hawaii, because we do have new mo'olelo. One of the things I tell my students, and this is, I think, a tricky thing, is that where are the new mo'olelo of our akua? Did they die in the past? Because if we can't write mo'olelo where our akua are in this modern landscape, where are they? What happened to them? Why can't we see them anymore? So So I do think that there's a place for translation, but there's also a place for us pushing forward and giving mana to new Mo'olelo as well.
Muted, sorry. I'm not sure I understand this question. If from Paul John Castillo, if you're going to translate the law again to Olelo, are you going to translate from English or from the Olelo in the, he wrote 1990s. I would guess that he meant 1890s. Oh,
yeah. I mean, I feel like, I mean, people weren't necessarily translating the law too. That was the thing, right? I think when Boaz Mahune them and the Ali'i and all of the other Lahaina Luna folks, they were writing the laws, right? They weren't translating them from other places necessarily. And that's why if you look at the early documents, the translator's note says that the Hawaiian, of course, will be the controlling version of these things because that's who wrote these laws and stuff like that. So, I mean, I think some were, of course, influenced by laws from other places, but I do think that they were written in Hawaiian first. And that's why it's weird that that they had that genealogical axiom later that Hawaiian could only be the translation of the laws, even though they were, you know, initially written in them. I think that, I mean, if that I answered, hope that answered that question.
I think final question. This is from Ainani Lee. How would you say or express the term theorist or theoretician in Hawaiian?
Oh, in Hawaiian? I don't know. I mean, because I guess that would depend on how we were going to use it in English, right? I mean, because there's so many ways of looking at what a theoretician does. And I still don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. But like, you know, because sometimes people put theory as the opposite of practice, right? Where you're just theorizing about something, you're not actually doing it, right? And that's not what I meant when I was talking about John Bush. He was this theoretician of kind of approaches to Ea and to Kuoko'a because he was putting them into practice, right? He was doing these things, but he was very kind of intellectual about it and he was thinking about it. So I don't know. I'm not sure what word you would use for something like that. I think it would have to really depend on how we were trying to use it and what the context of the translation was, you know? Like I don't know if even theoretician in Olelo Hawaii would be fitting if we were talking about Bush there. You know, I think calling him an Aloha Aina would imply that in a lot of ways, but I wouldn't say that Aloha Aina meant theoretician in these other contexts, right? But I would say that what he was doing that gets described as being a theoretician of sovereignty falls under what the other Aloha Aina were doing as well. And so I do think that that would fit under being called an Aloha Aina, but I don't think you can switch it around the other way. I don't know if that was a very confusing answer or what.
No, that sounds like a really thoughtful answer, like all of your answers and thoughts tonight. Any closing thoughts on?
No, I mean, I wish we could do this in person because I would love to hear more about people's questions. I'm really interested in what the Hermetic Principle idea is. I'm not familiar with that. And I think people have these really interesting connections and interactions with translation and with our Mo'olelo. And I would definitely love to have been able to hear more from you folks about that. And, you know, talk to Ha'alilio more about, you know, what are ethical and professional responsibilities with translators and stuff like that. Because I think they're important. But yeah, so I just want to thank you all very much for letting me talk so long in front of you from my bedroom. But yeah, mahalo, and thank you for having me here, Bianca and Lance. It's just so great.
Yeah. Well, mahalo, Bryan, for being here and yeah, for giving us so much of your time. And yeah, please check out the Facebook page. Hopefully, like you can do more justice to people's questions than I did. Okay. All right. Have a good night.